Hey, dickheads! We have a special pink laser beam of truth that's beaming only from San Diego, California, although two locations. We talked to Professor Craig Callender, a professor of science and philosophy at the University of California right here in San Diego. He has a PhD from Rutgers University, and where he wrote a thesis entitled Time's Arrow. He is an expert at time. So this entire episode is devoted to, you guessed it, the march of time, whether forward, sideways, or backwards. And we're going to get into all the issues related to Philip K. Dick's work in time travel and popular famous works of science fiction. Geeking out about science fiction. But anyways, it's a really good one. We're really proud of it. We hope you enjoy. Thanks, dickheads. Hello, Professor Craig Callender from the University of California, San Diego. Welcome to the Dickheads podcast.
Hello, hi. Thank you for having me.
So, our subject today is one that you do a lot of writing and research about and is considered an expert in. How does someone who is a professor of philosophy get interested in time?
Well, I've always thought of it as, when I was looking around for topics and that to think about, I always thought of it as one of the last great mysteries. So up there with consciousness and that. So we know that time exists. It's not just some sort of made-up thing. It's deeply important to our lives. It's also the subject of many different sciences. And so for me, it always seemed, the perfect sort of topic to do because, I had one foot in the sort of real world of science and that, but then also, deeply mysterious and strange and important to us. So for me, it just, it sucked me in.
Right. So there's a lot of physics involved in this. As a professor of philosophy, did you have to do a lot of training in physics or do more than your average physics courses being a philosophy person?
Yes, and it wasn't easy. So I took many courses in physics, and I even wrote research articles in physics, and so I'd probably have read as much physics as philosophy since 1990 or so.
Right.
So it's been a lot of physics.
Right. Well, I'd imagine you'd kind of have to because, for example, space and time are the same thing, or at least that's the theory from Einstein, correct?
Yeah, after Einstein came up with this theory, then his supervisor, Minkowski, famously said that space and time were doomed to fade away into mere shadows, and that there was just going to be replaced by space-time. And so the kind of picture you have in relativity is one of, instead of objects occupying different locations and then evolving through time, instead just think of a kind of manifold of a bunch of events. Your birthday, this interview, all sorts of two particles hitting each other. Mm-hmm. Think of all those events sort of laid out, and then there's still a difference between the space-like and time-like directions on that sort of mosaic of all events, but which one is space and which one is time? What aspects of each event are spatial and temporal can change depending on who you are. So they don't get completely mixed up, but they get a little bit mixed up. So take two events that are not connectable by a light ray. So two events that happen so fast with respect to each other that no light could get from one to the other. Think of like these two events like that. Now to actually get those two snapped together in this rest frame, they'd have to be like 1/1000th of a second apart as measured in this rest frame. But if I could get them so much that no light from the one could get to the other, then there'd actually be, in relativity, there'd be no objective order about which happened first. So things that are close up, that's generally not going to be the case. But maybe there's something going on in Andromeda, now, and whether it happened before or after this podcast is indeterminate. It depends on who you are, where you are, how fast you're moving.
Right. And so I know we like to think of things to be measurable by distance, and some things are measurable by time. For example, we have, a mile, or a second, or a minute, for example. Which do you have an opinion on? Is there one that is more reliable than the other? Or are they indivisible because space and time, we've discovered, are the same thing? Does that question make sense? I'm trying to make it as layman as possible here.
That makes sense. That's more a question of sort of like what units we want to use, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then, people do, there has been a gradual shift over the last 100 years, as I understand it, to using the second as, the sort of foundation of most of the units that we use. And so we define a meter in terms of how fast, light will, in terms of how fast light will go across space. Everything is, getting more and more things are getting tied to the cesium atom in a second defined in terms of its frequencies. That's not so much about relativity. That's more about like which units you want to use and which are more reliable.
Well, and I just listened to a talk by the cosmologist Paul M. Sutter, and he was talking about the cosmic calendar, the concept of the cosmic calendar, reducing the entire what we know about the universe into a calendar year, and basically he was calling BS on the thing. And he said at the end, the only thing that we can truly measure, the most important thing that we can truly measure, is the second. And that's what you're talking about, how when it comes down to time, since time is relative and gravity pulls us at different times and spaces, is that why the second is becoming so important to people in measurement?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I think it's just because, you have, so you've got the laws. The laws define a second, and they define also, a meter and things like that, and other, in spatial distances. And then there's a question of how do you match stuff in the world to that theory. Mm-hmm. Things in the world. So sometimes people think, and this is like a pet peeve of mine, sometimes people think that, you just sort of see an object and you think, oh, that's a clock, or that's a good clock. Mm-hmm. What makes it a clock? There's just, so if you're actually thinking about a clock on the wall, what makes that a good clock? It's just some physical object that's moving. The only thing that makes it a good clock is that it's, it's coming back to its initial state again and again, and it's doing so that in a way that approximately matches what the duration that physics is talking about. Similarly, like with a meter stick, if you actually took a meter stick and took a ruler, that wood is going to be expanding and contracting depending on the temperature, and so it's going to be a very imperfect, instantiation of a meter. The same thing happens with clocks. They're all imperfect. So when they say they define, so this will get kind of philosophical. So when they say they define, a second in terms of some frequency of the cesium atom, but then they say that they know that clock will go wrong in like 1 billion years. What do they mean when they say that they know it will go wrong? If they really defined it in terms of the second, if they defined the second in terms of that, how could it ever go wrong? Mm-hmm. But really, they're not defining it in terms of that particular object. It's always being defined in terms of the laws of nature, and then you're just finding some things in the world that sort of best approximate those things.
And how are seconds defined? I mean, that has to be somewhat of a recent, in the grand scheme of history, thing that we have like an actual scientific definition of what a second is. Because you can't have minutes or hours or anything if you don't have that foundation of the second. That's the most important part, right?
Yeah, but again, I think the real answer is that you're defining it in terms of this kind of ideal theory with the ideal laws. So if you think about, say, like Newton's laws, so if we in free fall, if you were in free fall, then max you could go, I don't know, 32 feet per second squared. So that implicitly defines what a second is. A second is that amount of time such that something in free fall, given the right idealizations, could fall that distance. And so you don't really get a kind of, a definition of, it's that clock that defines the second, or this one, or this pendulum clock, or that one, or this one. All those clocks are all wrong, eventually.
Right.
And so it's really just a theory that gives you it. And so all you're really doing is saying, oh, that thing out there, it behaves a little bit like that term in the theory.
Right. And I do want to tell our listeners that we're going to loosen up and talk about science fiction a little bit more later on in the interview and you have a little bit more fun. But I'm a nerd for this stuff, so I really want to get into it with somebody who's spent their life thinking about it. So I had this thought a couple years ago, back when, and you're a professor at the University of California, San Diego, and we're here in San Diego, so just to keep it local a little bit. Back when we had a football team that myself and Larry, our engineer, used to give a shit about. A couple of years ago, I went to see a Chargers Monday night football game against the Steelers, and I had this really weird experience where, because my father is a lifelong Steelers fan, and at the time I was a Chargers fan, and the Chargers had led the entire game, and with 3 seconds left to go in the game, and it was 8:30 for us. It was 11:30 on the East Coast where my father is. They're in Indiana because they were on Eastern time zone at the time, which is a whole other issue because Indiana is weird with time zones. But we were watching this football game live, and I was at the game, and this last second play where the Steelers had a go-ahead touchdown, and I called my father basically to curse him out because his team beat us, right? But he hadn't seen it yet, right? And he didn't know that they had won because of the delay between when it happened live and when it made it to the East Coast, but it was only by a couple seconds. So I still got to hear him laugh at me. And, of course, there were a lot of Steelers fans, and they were yelling at me. So I had this, concept of it. It was 11:30 for him. It was 8:30 for us. There was this last second play, so there was only 3 seconds in the game before the Le'Veon Bell ran in for the touchdown. And there was all these weird issues of time that were floating around, making me go, Jesus Christ, time is bullshit. Because there's the seconds of the game, and there's the time zone in Indiana, which Indiana should be in the central time zone, but they're in the eastern time zone, so it's 11:30 there. And all these things were going on, and then I thought to myself, GPS sometimes they give you that they try to give this concept that there's this one global time that goes by Greenwich means. But with the curvature of the Earth, with gravity and everything, is there any concept of the one moment that's going on? Is that a real philosophical concept? Is there a real physical concept? That's a lot of question for that, or a lot of talking for that one question. But I really wanted to cross the idea of what I was thinking about that night and how weird it was to me that was all going on. Anyways, sorry, Craig.
It's okay. Yes, so, well, let's see if I try to unpack that a little bit. Then
I know, there's a lot. But is there a real physical time that we're all at the same time?
Maybe, I don't know if this is satisfying at all or dodging it, but, approximately.
Right. Well, because, the concept of Greenwich means is supposed to be that is always the time at one spot on the planet, correct? Or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, so Greenwich Mean Time is one way of setting up a kind of conventional system of time, but it's only there's a lot of things going on. So like the GPS you're talking about, that's making relativistic corrections. In your smartphone, and that's all making relativistic corrections, both for gravity and just for regular special relativity reasons. When you were talking to your dad, though, that what you were noticing was the lag, and that is actually, I think, really interesting, because I think one thing we don't really pay attention to, and in some ways we're designed to not pay attention to, are these lags. And so recently in psychology, they've discovered some people who can notice the lags. They've got various. So if we were talking to each other, it takes a while for the sound to get over to you. My lips might still match the sounds, though. The visual impression of the lips might still match the sound. Notice that's kind of funny that happens, right? So if somebody comes up close to you, their lips still match their sound. If they walk far away from you, their lips still match the sound. Even though one's bouncing off their face, by light, at the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers per second. Sound super, super slow. And yet still you bind them together as happening now. You don't notice the lag. But some people do notice the lag. And it's, so they'll say, so if you say hi to them, they might hear you, the hi, and then see your lips move. Or the other way could happen. And so we don't really tend to notice that sort of thing, except for scenarios like when you're talking to your dad, then because the live versus non-live, you then end up noticing this lag. But if you really did notice, but this lag is happening all the time, all over the place, even just in the room with you and Larry, and if you were really, were able to pay attention super, super carefully, you would notice all these lags, and it would be really weird. And then you would never think that there was this sort of big universal time in marching in lockstep that everyone would agree upon. I don't think.
Right, and I'm wondering about how high altitude air travel affects us when we're going between time zones, because it seems like that would be a time where we might really notice it. You know what I'm saying? Like, because we are at high altitude and you're traveling really fast. Like, I know it's very small numbers, the relative changes, but when people have the experience of flying back from the East Coast and you gain hours and things like that, like, I wonder, how perceptible those things are versus, like, how real is it, that, like, do you lose time when you do that?
Well, traveling faster, yeah, there's a little bit of time dilation, and so relative to the people on the ground, you've aged a little slower. Mm-hmm. So there's been a fewer ticks of the clock on the body clock relative to them. That reminds me of a good book that's not really science fiction, but it's kind of by Lightman, called Einstein's Dreams. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
I have heard of it. I haven't read it. But
each chapter is sort of a different way relativity could have gone. And one of them was where there are fewer ticks the higher up you are. And so rich people then tried to move up higher and higher so they could have fewer ticks of the clock relative to poor people down below.
Right.
So they spend their lives in planes and cities that fly and stuff.
Right. Well, that, it is something, because when you do really get a concept when you travel across time zones, like, like, I know some people don't really notice it. Oh, we changed 2 hours, or we gained 2 hours back. But, it's impossible for me as a science fiction writer, reader, consumer, critic to not think about what that means to, like, oh, I just skipped 2 hours right now, because I know to a degree we're all time travelers. We're just all moving 1 second at a time forward, right? So, but I wonder, there's something that you write about a lot in the introduction to Time, the graphic novel, or the graphic book, about tenseless time. And I think that's a concept that, we always think of things in either the present tense or, future tense or past tense. But there is this concept of time without a tense. Could you explain that to our listeners, what tenseless time is?
Yeah, so if you think, the idea is to sort of think of time like space. When we think of space, we don't, we know, San Diego's here, Boston's here, New York, Paris, London, they all exist. Can't see them, but they exist. And we know that, and we don't think that the spatial here is special or carves up the universe into two or anything like that. But when it comes to time, we do tend to do that. It's very important to us that we do. And so we carve up the universe into past and present. But if you think about the other, but you don't have to. In fact, physics doesn't. So you could just make do with earlier than and later than relations. Mm-hmm. And say this event is earlier than that one's later than that one. Just like this one's to the right of that one's to the left of that. And so you could just think of that there's not so the tensed aspect is this idea that there's a kind of everything's relative to a now. And when we so our language picks up on this. So like in English, you can't really say anything without saying something about the tense. So when I'll say was, will, or is. And so just to communicate anything, I end up picking out a particular tense, either past, present, or future. Mm-hmm. And so it's so deep into our thought and language, behavior. But it doesn't have to reflect the actual, so the metaphysics or the physics. So a kind of tenseless theory, sometimes called the block view of time, is just the idea that it all exists. It doesn't all exist now. It just all just like not everything spatially, just like Boston doesn't exist here, San Diego does. Mm-hmm. The future doesn't exist now. By now we mean simultaneous with me talking. So I don't shrink it all down to the now, just like I don't collapse it all the space down to this location. But it's all there.
Yeah. But is there a now? Because now almost seems like bullshit, because it's 3 hours ahead in Boston than it is in San Diego, or 3 hours ahead, right, in Boston. And so if we just take Boston and San Diego, like our now and their now is completely different. But that's just this country. If we go beyond this planet even, there could be many different kinds of now that that are on a cosmological basis are just even hard for us to calculate, right? Or, is now bullshit? Or is now something... Is it enough for us to be here to declare now a thing?
Yeah, so in my other book, What Makes Time Special, the idea is basically, that now is bullshit. But then I try to explain why we use that bullshit and why it's important to us, even though it is bullshit. So those people in Boston, so there's something happening in Boston, so that is roughly simultaneous with the snap. Mm-hmm. So if we want to call that the now, and so don't worry about the time zones and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But we could just think of, I could send out a light ray in principle to some person with a mirror in Boston, have it bounce back and then I could take my time I emitted the light and the time I received it, divide by 2, and I would say that was when that was an event on my light on my world line. That event is when it hit the mirror over there. I could call that my now. And if so I could call that by now. So things are approximately simultaneous. But I don't have to. Why do I come up with that idea of a now? I think it's just basically because we're not moving that fast with respect to each other, and so we can talk about it now. And also, that's very useful for us to do that. So that we need to assemble the world. We need to solve this kind of problem of we've got all these signals bombarding us. Smells and sounds and light, and we need to figure out which things are associated with the same event and which things were associated with different events. And a critter that couldn't solve that problem would die pretty quickly, I think, and not live to mate and stuff. And so we need to be able to do that. And so we put together this kind of nice time order, which approximately matches the time order you get in physics. And by doing that, we are pretty successful. But we could, just, I think, erase now and get by with the earlier than and later than between everything. But we wouldn't be as happy, I think, if we did.
Right. Well, I have one more kind of deep question, and then we'll get into the fun stuff. We'll start talking about science fiction. So I have a buddy, an old friend, Mike Riccardi, who is I believe he does ecological city planning now, but I knew him as a really amazing drummer back in the day. But Mike asked, is space-time mind-independent? And if so, can we know them as they are in themselves? Or in other words, is our understanding of space-time limited by our cognitive faculties?
Well, that's a big one.
Yeah,
that's a tough question. I've just sort of approached that with. I mean, it's a good question. I've approached that in my own work just by thinking, well, let me accept basically what physics describes as physics is the only science that really tries to tackle time itself. And so I figure, well, I'll go with that. And of course, physics is changing. Maybe there'll be a quantum theory of gravity and things will be different. Who knows what the physics will be in 100 years. And people do say, well, time is such a deep feature that, and physics could be wrong or incomplete about time. So ultimately, physics is measuring, the locations of pointers at different places and all times, and it could be missing aspects of time. It might be able to, explain why matter and motion, really well, and still be missing something in some deep way. And so I'm open to that being a possibility. And so that's the way I'm interpreting, so we might not know time in and of itself. But the only way I think I can know anything is really through experiment and theory. And that's the best we've got so far. And so I'm sort of...
Yeah. And I would say, too, that in my opinion, it has to be mind independent in the sense that, and, it's a little easier for me because I'm looking at the question still, but I think the idea that space-time has to be kind of mind independent because you wouldn't have been able to find it if you're Einstein, right? If you weren't able to do experiments and find the fundamentals that create it. So it had to be there. Now, there are aspects of space-time that I'm sure we're still going to be discovering for years to come. And part of that could be just like the ability to look further and further into the past through telescopes like James Webb and the Hubble and all that. Well, if James Webb ever gets up there. But regardless, one of the reasons why I think science fiction is so well equipped to examine time is because, we get to play around in science fiction with these concepts. Philip K. Dick, who is the guy that we do this podcast for, like to play with time. How do you, as a person who's researched time, feel about how Philip K. Dick has approached the issue of time?
Well, of course, he was super inventive, and I think he's not so I get a lot of inspiration from science fiction, and so I read a lot of science fiction. And so with most of it, you get some hits and some misses in terms of what the philosophical or scientific payoff would be. Mm-hmm. So and that's definitely if there's any scientific fiction author of whom that's generally true, that's Philip K. Dick.
Right.
There's many hits and misses, and so when it comes to time, he's got many novels and short stories that talk about time travel, and so that's a lot of fun. And he talks about it in very different ways and different stories. In one of my first articles, I think I began it with Counterclock World, which is not a time travel story, but it's instead this kind of it's really pretty cool, but it's a little bit weird. Well, that's not surprising.
Right.
In Counterclock World, in 1986, the world enters the Hogarth phase, where entropy flips over. So normally you think of the direction of time as given by the direction of increasing entropy, and so you think the bull walks into the china shop, and then leaves behind all these broken vases and china all on the floor. The later state is one of much higher entropy than the earlier state. And, all of life, all of everything is due to the low entropy source of the sun, giving us all this usable energy. And then we emit out all this unusable energy in the form of high entropy. Anyway, so in the Dick story, he has the arrow flip. But the funny thing about it is that it doesn't like completely flip, because he wouldn't be able to tell the story if it completely flipped. And so people are still talking like normal, even though the direction of time is flipped. So they're not doing reverse talking, but they are doing reverse eating and reverse, it's disgusting, but reverse sort of excrement. They are picking up cigarette stubs from the ground and unsmoking them, cleaning their lungs as it happens. The dead are starting to call from their graves to be let out and anti-age. And then there's a big business in terms of getting the dead out from their graves. But it doesn't all flip. So, to tell a story, he's got to have all these sort of stuff happening in the normal course of the direction of time.
Well, I think maybe
it's super interesting because it's deep in the sense that it's perfect. It seems possible, according to the fundamental laws, that you could have the direction of time flip. So it's an awesome idea. The story is just an awesome idea that you could have, these kind of local flips. Seems like it's possible, according to most ways of thinking about the fundamental laws. On the other hand, the execution, at least, allowances have to be made based on having to tell a story. Then has problems.
Right. Well, and it's possible that too. I think if I was writing it, I would just imagine that I'm writing what people are saying, but their language going backwards might be different. I'm just translating it for this story. I know Isaac Asimov used to make jokes about how I'm never gonna write a story where I have they walked 5 glicks. I'm just gonna translate it in my story. But Counterclock World wasn't the only one where he did time slippage is a thing that he worked with before. And in Martian Time Slip, he had a character who, because they were autistic, they perceived time at a different pace. So perception of time was something that he had done before, which I think, you had already talked about earlier in this interview, is the lag and the concept of it. And I like the idea that somebody would be perceived as having a disability for, just being, perceiving time differently. And I wish that was a concept that he'd kind of explore deeper than just Martian Time Slip. But that is one that we saw too. I wonder what you think about that and the idea of people perceiving time differently.
Yeah, I need to read that because, there are studies about whether autism affects your perception of time. There are many, many studies of whether schizophrenia affects your perception of time. Many schizophrenics claim it does. And so, then it gets into something we haven't really talked about too, which is, when we're talking about time, there's all these different aspects to it. So one is just like duration. So is it, so like perceived duration, that seems to vary with almost everything anybody's ever studied. So it wouldn't be surprising if autism or schizophrenia end up affecting, so like if you get into a car crash, you'll say, oh, time froze for me. But you don't think that it froze, for everybody, right? So you think it's just a subjective feature of your mental state at that time. And maybe it wasn't even a subjective, maybe it's just about your memory is maybe more detailed later. Maybe it laid down more memories because it was such a traumatic event. And then now when you go back and think about it, maybe now you report it as having seemed like a long time. Anyway, so there's all of that kind of thing. And of course, drugs can affect your subjective impression of time. Probably that was inspired.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy, those 20 hours I was on speed writing just sure flew by, as I'm sure what he's thinking.
It's not that surprising they spent so much time talking about slippages in time.
Right. Well, yeah, and then he also, like, in stories like Paycheck and the Simulacra, he had this concept of a time scoop, where you'd have a device that could just pick out a piece of time to be observed, and you couldn't change anything, but you could see time forward, which played heavily into Paycheck, which became the movie with Ben Affleck, where he could send himself a message back in time and change the outcome of things. I wonder what you think of the science fictional concept of the time scoop.
Yeah, well, up until the last thing you said, I don't have a problem with it. But if there's some sort of changing from what really happened to a new really happened, then that kind of thing is not compatible with that kind of block universe we were talking about before. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there's nothing wrong with getting information from one bit of the block to another bit of the block. So if all the scoop does is just have these connections between different. So normally we don't get to have information from the future, and lots of stuff from the past there also we're missing out on. But there's no particular reason why you couldn't. Basically, this information flow is time travel, and according to arguably, according to general relativity, you could have time travel. So there'd be conditions, and it might be hard, and it might not be met. Those conditions might not be met in the story.
Right. Well, and I think
it's logically possible, and maybe physically possible.
And so I just finished an interesting time travel novel written by a UCSD grad, Gregory Benford. Are you familiar with his? Most people are familiar with Timescape, which is his classic from 1980.
Maybe I've even read it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but he just released a book last year called Rewrite, and Philip K. Dick and Einstein are actually characters in this book, and Robert Heinlein too. And Benford brings to it, and I'm really trying to get him on the show. Because he's a UC Irvine physicist. He brings not only science, but he knows Philip K. Dick and Heinlein. Obviously, he didn't know Einstein, but he played with that. And in this book, the main character time loops, where he is in a car accident in 2002 and dies and wakes up in his bed when he's 16 years old in 1968. And figures out that he is quantumly entangled with this moment in 1968. And the first time he goes back, he has this adventure where he takes all the knowledge he has about movies that happened in his lifetime, Back to the Future, Jaws, and he writes them first. And he becomes friends with Philip K. Dick and Robert Heinlein and has all these things. But then once he realizes that it's something that if he dies, he's going to go back to that same spot again, he tries to make the world a better place. But what keeps happening, and I'm kind of giving away a lot of the book, but there's this concept that he has in the book that you can go back in time and you can change things, but you never change things in your reality. It stayed the same, but you've created this other bubble reality by shooting back to this other moment, and now there's this other universe that is being changed by the changes that you're making. But he's quantumly entangled to this moment where he keeps having these breakaway universes. So I'm wondering how, as a time person, you feel about this concept that if you could travel back in time, you thus create another universe, just like you would, for example, like I drop this pen, everything changes, right? I don't know how you feel about. What do you think about the concept of this, anyways?
Yeah, I think it. Well, I'm a big fan of multiverse interpretations of quantum mechanics. But if you have them, then I think you can make sense of these kinds of things. Yeah, so on a kind of block universe, you could go back in time and you could change things in the sense that you could do things only if that's what always was what you did. Mm-hmm. So you can't do contradictions. But if you always were back there, you did it, and so it's you can do it. But now if you introduce a kind of multiverse picture, yeah, then it's it's not very satisfying time travel because now you so in the block universe picture, a single block, we know you can't go back in time and kill Hitler because Hitler did live. Hitler's on the block. You can't have Hitler and not Hitler both at the same event on the block. Only one event is there on the block, and unfortunately, it's the one with Hitler. Now if you introduce multiverses, now you can go back in time and you can kill Hitler. Of course, you didn't save anybody on the original block. All you did was wimpily run off to another universe with one without Hitler. But that kind of picture you could have, and a lot of people talk about that kind of picture. So it's time travel with the multiverse.
And so what you're talking about with the block is a concept that you talked about in the introduction to time about, and I wrote it down in my notes as time travel in the book no one wrote, right? So, And that's that idea that no matter what, if there's certain things that are locked in, they're going to happen. And so even if you traveled back, I think it's the concept of, well, maybe you should explain it instead of me trying to explain it. Can you explain the concept of time travel in the book no one wrote?
Yeah, so suppose I went to the local library and I bought Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And then I jump into my, I've got a kind of TARDIS machine in my house, and I jump into the TARDIS, and I dial it back to 15 whatever when Shakespeare was born, or a little later. And then I run up to him and, knock on his door, dump the book, and then, he comes out, opens the door, looks at the book. And it's a little hard for him to translate the contemporary English to, Renaissance English, but, he does so, copies it all down, has the plays made. Because the plays are made, then eventually, printers end up, somebody writes the story, printers print it, eventually gets, sold in a bookshop and then in a library, and then somebody like me picks it up. And so you have this kind of circle of a kind of what's called a closed causal loop, where the information contained in the book travels along in this loop, but don't think of it as traveling along around, because the block is just the block. It doesn't happen many times. It's just all there. Where normally, if A causes B and then B causes C, then A is before B and B is before C. Now you have A causes B, B causes C, C causes A, where, because Shakespeare wrote that down, it then got, made into a play. It then got picked up into a library. It then got sent to, back in time to Shakespeare. And so in that kind of picture, you have no one who came up with the story. And it's completely consistent logically. And so philosophers like to think about the different time travel stories in science fiction and film and divide them up into the consistent ones and the inconsistent ones.
Right.
So to think about Terminator 1, I think it's consistent. So, there the Terminator is traveling back in time, but if the Terminator didn't do what the Terminator did, then there wouldn't have been the dark, evil future from which created him in the first place. And so in a way, he, you could think he had to do it or that, but the shirt I'm wearing, 12 Monkeys, people think of 12 Monkeys as one of the great consistent stories. Bruce Willis goes back into the past, not to change it, but to find out what happened so that later in the future they can, come up with a cure. It then turns out that his actions end up being crucial in creating the plague that happened. Anyway,
I've got one, and you talked about it in your book, but All You Zombies by Robert Heinlein, which was also made into a film, Predestination with Ethan Hawke. Does that one fit? Is in that loop, or is that one too wacky?
Yeah, no, that one's that one's is actually mentioned in a very, very famous philosophy of time paper by David Lewis on time travel, in which he says that that's consistent. It's also the example where I completely failed as a teacher. I remember saying to my class that story is consistent, and then I said, and you can tell if it's consistent because you can just draw a space-time diagram of what happened. And if you can draw it, because the world is consistent, it should be consistent. And then I went to the board and then tried to draw the space-time diagram off the cuff of what happened. Because there, the protagonist is his own mother and father. And it ends up being this kind of triple embedded loop with an entry and exit. When you try to draw the person's lifetime on a space-time diagram, it's very confusing. But I think on Wikipedia somebody did it, or there's some place where if you Google it, it comes up, the consistent drawing. But All You Zombies is great because it also shows that, that's old sci-fi, you tend to think of it as sort of more conservative, like Asimov and that. But you could see actually Heinlein, sort of went maximally weird right from the get-go.
Right.
The consistent, maximally weird right from the get-go.
Right. And I think Harlan Ellison's episode of The Outer Limits, Soldier, the one he sued James Cameron over for The Terminator, is also another really good example of the looping, consistent science fiction. So now we've talked about some of the ones that are really well done. What are some of the time travel novels or films that bug you the most?
Well, obviously the worst one is Back to the Future.
Right.
I mean, what the hell is going on there with the photographs and the faces vanishing off from the photographs? That's really hard to explain. You could try to invent a bunch of new metaphysics and physics to try to come up with, why, I don't know, quantum leap happens, or some of the Star Trek episodes are not so consistent, but some are, I think. But
well, one of the fun parts
of the future is really a problem.
Well, I have two funny things about that. One is that in Gregory Benford's book, part of one of the time loops is that the main character, Charlie, and Einstein rewrite Back to the Future in one of the time loops. And so, like, Einstein gets a reincarnated Einstein gets a writing credit on this revised version of Back to the Future. And one thing that's really funny about that is I recently heard Sean Carroll, the cosmologist, say that in one of his meetings with Marvel over Endgame, and he couldn't talk about it for years because he was embargoed, but he had met with the filmmakers, and he said that he was the one that basically explained to them why Back to the Future was bullshit, which became a line of dialogue in Endgame where they just said, I mean, you're telling me, and he was like, I'd like to take credit for that line.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and but I'm sure there's others. What are some other ones? I mean, I know Back to the Future is the big one. What about what was the Time After Time? How do you feel about Time After Time, the H.G. Wells Jack the Ripper one?
Yeah, I don't know that one so well.
Okay. Yeah, because that one I think it's a fun movie, but again, like Back to the Future, there's sometimes where I find myself scratching my head on that one. But I don't know. Are there any other ones that really, really bother you?
Looper was great, I thought, until the end. I don't know if you remember Looper.
Yeah. We're big fans of Looper here.
Yeah, so it was holding consistent. It was holding steady and consistent through most of the film, if I remember. And then at the end, when then at the end, he's able to shoot him. He's able to shoot. What happens? He shoots himself at the end. Mm-hmm. And then it ends up. It does end up undoing something. If I remember, mm-hmm. I remember it as being basically consistent through like 90% of the show, and then
Yeah, like a fast break where the guy misses the dunk.
Also, many films where we don't know, where there's just not enough information in the film, like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. If they brought them back and put them back, and maybe wipe their memories or something,
right?
Rates in history, then maybe it's consistent. I don't know.
Right. Well, and that, the big one with, Doctor Who, and we're both Doctor Who fans here, but, I mean, there's so much hand-wavium you have to do with Doctor Who, and I think there's probably a lot of times where you're like, oh, this is a fun one, I like this one, but at the same time, I think Doctor Who gets a little bit more of a pass because it's so much more fantasy than it is science fiction, really.
Yeah, I don't know why. Yeah, so I love Doctor Who as well, and I don't know why I'm so happy to give it a pass. But yeah, it's just good fun, and I don't know.
Well,
all that time being a wiggly wobbly,
timey wimey, yeah.
The theory behind that is not so clear.
Right. Well, and I think with Doctor Who, the only way to actually, I think, make sense of it is you have to kind of go with a multiverse concept of it. I mean, you kind of have to, that there is this kind of multiverse that the Doctor is traveling between, and maybe the only consistent thing we're seeing is him, right? Through all of it. Him or her, I should say.
Yeah.
And so I think I kind of go okay with that with that. But so okay, now here's a big question that we can kind of start to wrap things up with, which is, well, first of all, have you ever thought about writing science fiction to try and get some of these ideas out yourself?
I would love to, but I don't think I could have the skill for it. But I do think about it every now and then. But I mean, I've got a rich amount of information on having spent my life thinking about all these sorts of things.
Right. So now, on that note, there's
but that doesn't, as you know, that doesn't mean somebody can be good at one thing but not good at another thing.
But there are a lot of really good storytellers who are out here listening to this podcast. So, do you have any challenges you'd like to put out to the science fiction community? Things that you would like to see us explore more with time travel? I know that's a big one.
I don't know. The problem is, science fiction is usually out in front first, so it's hard to imagine being out in front of the thing that's usually the most out in front.
Well, I mean, is there something that you're just like, man, I think about this aspect of time all the time. Why hasn't anyone touched on this?
The second half of my more serious book, What Makes Time Special, talks a lot about so it has like a couple of chapters on looking at the world sideways. So, normally you think of this a block and time is going up. And I have a lot of stuff on whether you could, if we could tell the story of the world going sideways, sort of, from east to west instead of past to future. So taking really seriously the kind of block and then thinking about evolving. So I have a lot of stuff on like whether physics could deduce what will happen, sort of not next in time, but the next street over, given all of time on one spot. So I don't see that kind of. I haven't seen the most I've seen. There's Greg Egan has a book where he reimagines physics, where you have a non-relativistic signature, and it's really technical and hard to get into.
Right.
It's really very, very difficult. And
what's the title of your book with about time being special?
What Makes Time Special?
What is the title of the book? Okay. Yeah. I didn't get a chance to read all your stuff yet, but I'm going to, because I'm super fascinated with this, and I might take up that sideways challenge. So.
Maybe another thing is, science fiction authors are already taking it up, but just to give a kind of shout out, because I think it's really awesome. Well, think of Greg Egan. He's got that short story, The 100,000 Light Year Diary. Have you ever seen this?
No.
So the idea is the astronomers find a time-reversed galaxy. They bounce information off it, and it comes back before they sent it. And in light of this mechanism, the government sets up these satellites which bounce information off that satellite. And so each day, at the end of the day, you get about 10 minutes to type up what happened that day. You then send it from your computer up to the satellite. It then sends it to this galaxy. End result, when you're born, you're given the book called The Book of My Life. And it's everything you wrote about what's going to happen to you. And so it's an awesome way to think about what would, does our sense of free will, is it all due just to ignorance about the future? So it's a great way to get a mechanism for getting information about the future. And so the protagonist is about to type like the T in, he goes, I know I do type the T here, but do I have to? But I did because I can see it here in the book of my life.
Right.
He's about to go meet this woman who he knows is going to become his wife. She knows he's going to cheat on him and be a dirtbag, and then she knows she's still going to fall in love with him, and does. And so there's that, and then there's Ted Chiang's the story that Arrival was based on, the story of my life, which also was. I saw an interview with him. They did a premiere of Arrival at UCSD, and they had a Q&A with him afterwards. And he said in the first draft of the book there were no aliens. Isn't that weird?
Right, because it seems so important to the story.
Yeah, so he wanted to get at this kind of emotional question of if you knew what was going to happen, would you do it differently? And so then he thought of the aliens as a mechanism for doing that. Anyway, this question of if you had information from the future, would it just sort of demolish our way of thinking about free will? So that would be time. Another way, of course, of doing it would just be time travel or Dick's scoop going. Getting a scoop from the future.
Right.
But if you had all that information, and apart from it being physically difficult due to thermodynamics, if the information's there, you should be able to get it. Would it then destroy everything? And so I like these stories where the people have, science fiction authors have imagined ways of getting information from the future and then thinking through all, some things that really are so very deep about being a human being, and that really seem to rely on just the contingent fact that we can't get information from the future.
Well, Craig, I really appreciate your time because it is so special, right?
Yes.
And thank you for giving us a block of it. Where can people find out more about your ideas? What books do you have? What kinds of things online would you point people to if they wanted to learn more about your work?
Yeah, I think pretty much everything they can get at CraigCallender.com, if they spell my name right, which is not Callender. And there'll be links to my books and articles and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of really good interviews with you on YouTube as well. So, you don't have to end here. You can look more into Craig's work online. I highly recommend it. YouTube is where I first discovered Craig, just floating around looking for things on time. And when I saw that you were here local, I was like, oh, man, I want to get him on the show. Just because I think time is... it's obviously fundamental to everything that we do as human beings, but it's also so fundamental to the career of Philip K. Dick. And I want the dickheads out there to really think deeper about these issues, because one of the reasons we do this podcast is not only so we can learn more from PKD by looking deeper, but so his influence can go deeper into the writers of the next generation and the philosophers too. So I appreciate your time. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's very nice to talk to you too.